All right, welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be back here for another edition of our At Home with Nature series. So my name is Jen. I am an educator with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, and today we're going to be talking about invasive species. So last week, if you tuned in, Jen Smith had a really great tour of all of the invasive species that are in the Meadowway. She talked a lot about why some of these species are so good at kind of reproducing and replicating and taking over our native ecosystems. So today we're going to switch our gears a little bit, and I thought I would focus a bit more on some of those invasive species that take up woodland areas, shaded areas. They might be growing in an understory of your backyard or garden. I'm also going to be talking about some best management practices too for some of these plants. So if you do have them in your garden, we can go over some of the main ways that you can remove them. If you do have any questions, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, just on my other device, so you'll see me kind of going back and forth a little bit. But if you have any questions, definitely put them in the chat. If you have any ID guesses, so I will be showing some actual plant samples. If you have an idea of what it is, definitely put it in the comments. It's also important to note that all of these plants I did collect from my little courtyard area behind me here, and some of my neighboring backyards out there. So it is really important to remember to not transplant or move any sort of invasive species, just to prevent them from spreading any further. Okay, so with that, we're gonna go over our first species. So this first one has a very unique lifespan. It has a 2-year life cycle, so this is its first year of growth. It has very broad, kind of kidney-shaped leaves, dark green. They typically grow in more of a rosette pattern in their first year of growth. So this is our kind of first year plant. The leaf size can vary quite a bit. So here's some smaller ones and then this great big huge one. So it kind of depends on just how much room they have available, how much nutrients. And then we also have our second year growth. So our second year growth is quite a bit taller. So instead of growing in that little kind of rosette clump, getting all its roots ready, it actually sends its shoots upwards. It has kind of this whitish color flower. The leaves are still somewhat kidney shaped, but they become a little bit more elongated and variegated as they get older. You'll also see this one is starting to kind of form these little pods. These little pods will be where the seeds will be released from. Let's see if we have any guesses of what plant this is. So if you have any guesses, put it in the comments. Alright, so this is, if anyone guessed correctly, garlic mustard. So garlic mustard is a pretty invasive plant just because it can produce a ton of seeds. So a really dense form of garlic mustard that's really well established can produce around 60,000 60,000 seeds per square meter. So that is a ton of seeds. Not only does it produce a high amount of seeds, it also has a really intense seed bank. So the seeds can actually stay completely viable in the soil for up to 30 years. So if you do have a well-established clump, it will take a little bit of time and effort to actually remove this plant. So this plant was originally native to Eurasia and Europe. It was brought here as a herb back in the early 1800s, just because it is got quite a nice garlicky taste and smell. There's a video on our Facebook page of garlic pesto recipe. So unfortunately these guys are super invasive. They form really dense colonies really quickly. If you disturb the soil at all, this plant will actually start to germinate some of its seeds. So the second you pull it, that soil is disturbed and some more seeds just start popping up. So that's why it's so difficult to remove. So if you do have it at your home, one method would be to hand pull. Usually during a wet day, so it's nice and rainy out there today. Today would be a good day to remove garlic mustard, just because you can pull up as much of the root as possible without breaking up all the soil around it. Another method too is just to continually kind of chop it down throughout the early spring so that it stresses it out. It can't photosynthesize, it can't produce seeds. This method also just helps any sort of soil disturbance as well. It's also a good idea to plant some native plants in its place to prevent more of that 30-year-long seed bank from continuing to grow. So things like mayapple and wild ginger, they can help actually shade out those seeds. So that is our garlic mustard. All right, so our next plant has kind of three, so each leaf is kind of a distinct 3 leaflet. You can see that. This plant can come in either a solid green color or a variegated one like I have here. So it has the white kind of variegated leaves. Again, we've got those serrated tooth edges along the side of the plant, or each little leaflet here. It's also in the carrot family. So we've got a big kind of umbrella-like flower that typically starts to show up in kind of early summer, midsummer. See if we have any guesses. Yeah, goutweed. So someone guessed right. So this is goutweed. It was originally brought over just as an ornamental because it is really great at growing basically anywhere. They can reproduce by a couple different ways, so by seed. The seeds though, they're not quite as good at dispersing themselves as certain other seeds might. So typically if they are germinating by seed, they're just dropping the seed right where kind of they're growing, and that's where it's going to germinate. The seed bank also doesn't last as long as the garlic mustard, sorry. So typically how it's really growing along is actually its rhizome. So underground, it sends out little roots and is actually able to just pop up from various different places. So that's kind of the main way that you're going to want to remove it, is by hand pulling. Again, because if you leave any sort of roots or plants, they can sprout back up, so just make sure you're cleaning your area really well, just in case any of them do continue to pop up. If you do have a really dense, well-formed colony of goutweed, sometimes the best way is to actually just blanket it with some sort of solarization tarp, so some sort of black fabric or heavy tarp. It's not the most visually appealing to have in your garden, but it is really effective at kind of wiping out that plant. I mean, if you do kind of go that way, a good way to get around it is to have some sort of container gardening on top of the plastic sheeting, and then next year that area is going to be good to go and ready to plant. Alright, there's a big helicopter flying over me, so I'm going to give it a second before I start talking about our third plant. Awesome. All right, so this is our next plant. It has kind of a 3-pronged kind of waxy leaf. Often the veins of this plant are white. It's technically a vine, so a woody evergreen vine, but it's often found as a ground cover as well. They are also evergreens, so these leaves stay out all winter long. They often will take over understories of forests, kind of wiping out any sort of native species like trillium and trout lily. They are super versatile, so they're able to grow in really any condition, heavy shade, sun, just about anything really. And because they all also are able to climb, I think I have an example. Yeah. So they have kind of these like grabby little bits that they stick out from their stem here, that they're actually able to grow up and attach to trees really, really well. So what tends to happen is that these plants will grow up, they'll wind themselves around a tree so tightly and so densely that over time it can actually kill the tree. So not only are they destroying our understories of our forests, they're also potentially killing off really large kind of established trees. So I see a few guesses. This is in fact English ivy. So English ivy was brought over again kind of early to late 1800s, and it was brought as an ornamental plant for people to feel a little bit more at home in their gardens. Since then, this plant has been cultivated into hundreds of different varieties, so they come in all different shapes and colors now, that you'll see different color variations. If you do have these in your yard, I will say that a lot of times they will come in things like hanging baskets or garden or kind of like little arrangements. Those are not too bad just because they will typically will die off at the end of summer. But if you are, you know, in a ravine or close by, you want to make sure that these aren't escaping from your garden. Now the one that I have here is a juvenile. English ivy takes upwards of 10 years to actually reach maturity. So before then, it just kind of, you know, it produces little rhizomes, it sends out little shoots, kind of similar to goutweed. Around age 10 is when it's going to start to mature. And then that's when it's going to start to produce berries and small flowers as well. So I don't have an example of the berries or anything with me today just because it takes so long for that plant to establish. There's actually records that English ivy can live up to 400 years. So these plants can really survive through thick and thin. If you do have these in your yard, hand pulling again is one of the best methods, making sure to get every little bit of root and little rhizomes that are stuck on your trees, onto the ground, in your mulch, things like that. Since it isn't evergreen, I would actually suggest that you remove these in the winter because you can see them really well. There isn't really any sort of vegetation that's going to be all tangled up in them, so you don't want to be ripping, you know, the flowers out of your garden. So I would definitely recommend winter. You can do it in the summer. If you do have some vines kind of stuck to your tree or climbing up, all you have to do is simply, you know, take like a butter knife or something, slip it kind of in behind the vine, and then slowly lift it out. Now sometimes these can get extremely large, so the woody part of this vine can be so thick that you actually won't be able to just kind of cut through it with simple like scissors or things like that. You might actually have to use a handsaw to kind of go at the stem of this vine. If you are using a handsaw, you just want to be super careful that you're not slicing into the bark. So even if you can get a little bit of leverage, get something kind of sticking behind the vine and then saw, that's going to give you a little bit more protection. So those were kind of the main three I wanted to cover in terms of removal. A couple other things to consider in terms of removing these invasives is just to make sure that you are disposing of them properly. So a lot of our invasives, as I was saying, things like goutweed, English ivy, they can just re-sprout from the tiniest little piece. So if you are throwing it into your compost or your lawn waste, unfortunately then they can just, you know, kind of fester away in that nice environment and then reproduce and then end up in people's compost and things like that. So we want to make sure that we're being very careful about how we're disposing of them. If you are interested in IDing some of the plants in your yard, if you're not too sure, we're going to link to this invasive plant guide. It's put out by Ontario Native Plant Council, and it has lots of great pictures, descriptions of all of the plants as well. So you can definitely check this out. Another great resource put out by Ontario Native Plant Council is the Grow Me Instead guide. So there's a bit of glare on that, but the Grow Me Instead guide is so awesome in terms of picking plants that are right for your yard. So basically it will give an example, let's say, of a ground cover. So we've got our English ivy and our periwinkle, and then it gives you some native alternatives to actually replace those with. So this is a really great guide. Again, we'll link to this website at the end of the video. This Ontario Native Plant or Invasive Plant Council, sorry, also has really great best management documents, which I consulted in terms of making this video. So definitely check that out. They give you a whole bunch of different options in terms of if you have really dense colonies or if you just have, you know, a few here and there. So I definitely recommend, if you do have anything in your yard, they'll go over everything you need to know in terms of removal, disposal, all of that stuff. So definitely check that out as well. So before I wrap up, I'm gonna do a quick little scan because I've seen a couple good comments coming in. So yeah, someone brought up a really great point of why do we continue to sell non-Indigenous plants that end up being invasive and damaging our ecosystems. That's very true. It is very, you know, kind of disheartening to see going into a garden center how many invasive plants there are for sale. I mean, luckily some of them are actually banned, and that's been through things like, you know, research and education advocacy. So plants like Japanese knotweed are completely banned. Same with dog strangling vine. It is against the law to move them, to propagate them, anything like that. So if we can continue to kind of fight for some of these species, we can hopefully reduce the amount of plants that we are kind of sending out into the world. That being said, as you know, as I was mentioning before, there are things like English ivies that are good for hanging baskets and stuff like that. It's just important that if we are purchasing these plants, we need to be responsibly kind of disposing them at the end of summer. So once that hanging basket's kind of looking not so great, then it's time to just kind of remove those pieces and dispose of them in the garbage versus your lawn waste. So there is ways of responsibly using these plants, but it's really just about getting the education pieces out there and really sharing kind of how detrimental they are. So that's a great question. So someone else asked, when do garlic mustard seeds drop? So they typically will start to drop their seeds kind of late June, beginning of July, kind of depending on what kind of growing conditions they're in. So the ones that I have here, they're not, you can kind of start to see, so once the seeds really start to develop in these little pods, you'll actually be able to see little black specks, and those are actually the seeds. So once your garlic mustard hits that stage, it is not the greatest idea to remove them, just because you could potentially release all those hundreds and hundreds of seeds. So if you have garlic in your yard, this is kind of the now or never. If not, you'll have to wait until next spring to actually remove the garlic mustard. That's a great question. I see someone asked for the link to the guide. Yep, so I see we've just got the guide in there now. So if you do have any further questions, definitely check that out. If there are any requests for more invasive plants to be covered. If you have certain invasives in your yard and you're not really sure how to remove them, definitely put them in the comments, because I can do another follow-up video maybe in July just about some more species that everyone's kind of experiencing in their yard. Other than that, if you are interested in introducing lots of new native species, we have a couple of really good gardening presentations coming up in both June and July, so check out our events calendar. Adding native plants is a really great way of kind of blocking out some of those invasives from taking over. So if you can introduce some of these native species, it's going to be super helpful for any of the wildlife in your yard. So I see a couple good recommendations pouring in for another video, so that's great to hear. Keep an eye on for our events calendar, and we'll let you know when we're going to be covering some more. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, everyone. I'll stick around a little bit in the comments if you have any questions. All right, thanks everyone, and have a good one.